I have been learning a lot about El Nino in preparation for this show, and I've seen several people say that, El Nino and La Niñas are very predictable. Yet 2014 was supposed to be a major El Nino, and it just didn't pan out.
So, right, in 2014 was a very interesting event. Now, we at the CPC, we didn't predict it to be a major El Nino. We did predict it to be, at least probability-wise, to be an El Nino, and it just didn't take. It was really interesting, actually, from a scientific standpoint, although, if I wanted my forecast to verify, I would have preferred it becoming an El Nino. But it was interesting because the waters in the Central and Eastern Pacific Ocean looked very much like El Nino. They looked like it was a very borderline weak El Nino, but an El Nino nevertheless. The problem was that the atmosphere reacted like there was no El Nino there. There was no coupling between the ocean and the atmosphere. So we only really had one half of what we needed for declaring an El Nino. And this year was the complete opposite. We've basically seen the waters warm up. We've seen the atmosphere react exactly the way we expected the atmosphere to react. So it's been basically what you normally expect to see during El Nino. But you can certainly say we had a little bit of a false start in 2014 that was very interesting.
So in 2014, one of the primary reasons that it didn't end up panning out was because the westerly winds didn't crank like they were supposed to?
Right, that's exactly right. So basically we saw the ocean warm, but we didn't really see the response in those trade winds and at upper levels that we'd normally expect to see. So we've had this big sloshing of warm water kind of move from the west to the east. It moved from the west to the east in the Pacific Ocean, but we didn't really see the winds really respond the way we would expect them to. We didn't really see that moving of convection further off to the east thunderstorms to the east that we expected it to. We basically just kind of saw it, just the ocean respond and not so much the atmosphere. But 2015 showed none of that and basically just saw that exactly what you'd expect to see during El Nino, and we've been seeing it strengthen all the way back since we declared El Nino here in March of 2015.
One of the other things I've been reading is that El Nino appears, in periods of 2 to 7 years. So I guess when I'm looking at graphs that show El Ninos versus La Niñas, and La Niñas are kind of the opposite, where you have the cooler water. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay, so I guess one of the things that I'm wondering is if 2014 didn't pan out, it looked like it was going to be similar to 97. It started out with some of the same diagnostics as 97, but it didn't work out. Does that is that a bit of a cumulative effect, adding to the probability that 2015 was going to be this large El Nino event?
That's a great question. And certainly this event started at a warmer standpoint than you'd normally expect to see an El Nino start. And when I say that, that's because we had this failed El Nino in 2014. So the waters actually already were slightly above average in the Pacific Ocean, but they weren't up the El Nino standards. It kind of helped out basically the beginning of it. But, there's a lot of other things that go on, not necessarily because we had a 2014 failed event necessarily mean that 2015 was going to be a super event, a really strong event. We basically here at CPC, we only classify it as weak, moderate, and strong. But when we're talking top 3 event, just because we had this failed event in 2014, it didn't really give us too much information that 2015 was necessarily going to be a top 3 event. But it may have helped us out to know at least that maybe 2015 would have formed an El Nino itself. But not at least not telling us too much about the strength of the event as it ended up being.
I understand. And the water temperature changes in an El Nino event. What are we talking about? What is the mean temperature that we would look at to create these types of conditions?
So when we define an El Nino event occurring, we're looking at a very specific region in the Pacific Ocean, not the entire Pacific Ocean. A Pacific region that's basically honestly, it's kind of in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific Ocean. It's called the Niño 3.4 region. It spans a pretty broad area between 5 north and 5 south along the equator. And that area was chosen because that specific area kind of perfectly exemplifies where we would expect to see above average sea surface temperatures during El Nino, and also where, if we kind of looked at weather conditions in the United States during El Nino and areas in the Pacific Ocean, they kind of correlate the best to each other. When one thing changes in the Niño 3.4 region, you tend to see the biggest El Nino impacts in the United States. So because of that, the temperatures there, we define El Nino as occurring when temperatures in that box are greater than 0.5 degrees Celsius over a 3-month period. As long as an expectation that we think that this is going to continue for quite a while, over 5 consecutive 3-month periods. And we define a weak event as 0.5 to 1 degree Celsius, and then a strong event above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And right now, this event is over 2 degrees Celsius in a place where really only 97, 98 and the peak of 1982, 83 ever came close to touching in that region.
So I thought that I read that in December at one point the degrees even exceeded 3 degrees. Is that correct?
It depends on which data set you use. One of the benefits of living in modern day is that we have lots of things looking at other things across the globe. We have satellite data sets that look at sea surface temperatures. We have observational data sets that use buoys and use ships to figure out the ocean temperatures. And depending on which data set you use, you'll get different total numbers. But there's ranges. I wouldn't take any number as gospel because, no matter which way you try to measure, you're never going to get a perfect sampling of the Pacific Ocean because it's so big, and there's not too much out there to measure. But certainly we've set monthly records in that region in a variety of data sets. We've set weekly records in a variety of data sets for strongest ocean temperature. So we're certainly seeing an event again, as I mentioned, that the likes of which we do not see that often.